Section 126 of China, Japan, and the Islands of the Pacific. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. The World Story, Volume 1. China, Japan, and the Islands of the Pacific. Edited by Eva March Tappan. Section 126. Japanese Children and Their Games. By Sir Edwin Arnold. The children of Japan charm everybody who visits the country, from the highest to the lowest ranks, and almost without exception they are the best behaved, least mischievous, most sedate, demure, correct, amusing, and unobnoxious specimens of minute humanity to be found on the globe. The average American boy, especially if born in well-to-do homes, is an egotistic, noisy, restless little tyrant, who makes a railway saloon or a drawing room a place of torture to his elders. The average English boy, more shy and silent, is yet by nature full of mischief and suppressed devilry, and is too often capable of the most fiendish cruelty. As for girls, they are everywhere, of course, more docile and gentle than their brothers, and seldom provoke the sensitive mind to thoughts of infanticide. But the Japanese babies and children, boys and girls alike, delight and comfort the foreign visitor by their ideal propriety. The streets, the houses, the temples, the gardens, the railway lines are free and open to them, for their playground is all out of doors. Yet they never seem to be in the way, or to damage anything, or to forget their good manners, or break flowers and shrubs, or put stones on the track. They are so preternaturally and prematurely reasonable. This does not imply that they are dull or indifferent or lifeless. On the contrary, nowhere is youth so joyous as with young Japan. These little ones chirp like sparrows at every corner, and flit from pleasure to pleasure like butterflies in a flower garden. I think such a pretty state of things is due, first of all, to their gentle, tender, dutiful mothers. Nowhere in this world have small boys and girls more affectionate, patient, devoted bringing up than the little Japs get on the breasts and at the knees of their Okisan. And this, in after years, they richly return, the reverence for father and mother being the very keystone of the national ark. Filial piety is, next to loyalty, the cardinal virtue of the land, even carrying the people occasionally to an extravagant or even criminal lengths. The classic picture of a good son in the Japanese print shops represents a certain young man who, in the season of mosquitoes, stripped himself bare at bedtime, and so lay down near his parents in order that the mosquitoes might feed on him and let the honored elders alone. And lately there was a dreadful case in Tokyo, where a man actually killed his wife because he had been told that nothing short of that would bring back to health his sick mother. Such a deed, of course, shocked public opinion nearly as much in Japan as it would do in England, but it illustrates the force and prevalence of parental and filial dutifulness in the empire. Another reason why the Japanese children grow up so good, so charming, so candid, so amenable is, I think, because they never heard of such a thing as original sin, and are never treated on the system which belongs to it. By Buddhist belief, no doubt, every little Jap comes into the world with the mistakes of a previous existence to atone for and to cancel. It is the doctrine of karma or ingwa, but parents, friends, neighbors, and teachers leave all that to destiny and to the kami-sama. Their part is to treat the small being as a new come guest into the garden of life, to be received with grace, kindliness, and consideration as a stranger, and not to be bullied and browbeaten into correctness. Go and see Jane, what Master Reginald is doing, and tell him not to do it. Such was the legend of one of Mr. Du Maurier's child pictures in Punch. But a Japanese mother and a Japanese child could never even have comprehended the joke. They do not slap, or thwart, or forbid and constrain the little ones in Japan, although they very strictly train them to make bows and to be silent and submissive and respectful, and it is a great recommendation of what may be called the anti-Solomonic plan that the children repay courtesy with courtesy and consideration by consideration. Moreover, they see so much of their own world in very early days that they do not break forth, like those of Europe, into its wonders and excitements fresh and frisky from the nursery. At 5 or 6 weeks of age the Japanese baby goes out into the open air, lashed on the back of its mother, sister, aunt, or nurse, and there it rides all day long, except as necessary intervals of refreshment, taking its slumber in this peripatetic cradle, and when awake seeing everything which goes on in the streets with its little slant-lidded, beady black eyes, so that, when it comes to the point of being able to toddle for itself, nothing is strange to the observant babe. It owes also to that early life in the open air and perpetual motion on the back of some relation or another, a large part of the generally robust health enjoyed by its kind. Japan is of all countries, except England, that wherein the fewest children die between birth and the age of 5 years, albeit another point in favor of Japanese babies is that they are nursed at the breast until they are 2, or even 3 years old. In every way their world is made very pleasant to them at starting. The towns and villages are full of toy shops, where the most grotesque and ingenious playthings are sold for their benefit, at the lowest possible cost. When there happens a temple feast, a matsuri or enichi, the precincts of the holy shrine are crowded with toy stalls, and the portable shops of the amiya, blowing out of bean paste all sorts of sweeties, shaped into dragons, snakes, birds, demons, and the like. Nobody is too proud or grand to carry a baby, or to be seen bearing home through the streets ridiculous creations of fluffy tigers, feathery cocks and hens, or balls of wool and tinsel. At the great wrestling match this year in Ecoin, I watched a huge sumotori, the champion of his class, overthrow his opponent after a tremendous struggle, amid the delighted plaudits of some 3,000 spectators, who flung 100 hats and caps into the ring. 10 minutes afterwards I met the same gigantic hero outside the wrestling theatre in the street, carrying a bit of a baby on his back, by the side of his little glossy-haired wife, and feeding it over his brawny shoulder with salted plums. The Japanese children have, by the way, a vocabulary quite of their own, just as the jinrikisha men talk their own patois, and the court people use a special form of speech, while even Japanese women employ many words and phrases never heard from the lips of men. One distinguishing feature of the children of Japan is their sleeves. After much observation and meditation in the streets and roadways of the country, one arrives at last at an explanation of the extreme dignity which the little ones exhibit under almost all circumstances. It is due, you perceive, to the long flowing sleeves which they wear. Nothing in respect of dress gives so much importance and presence to the human figure, grown or ungrown, as wide and hanging sleeves, and all the little Japanese, when habited at all, go about in tiny gowns very much resembling those worn by masters of arts and doctors of divinity at Oxford and Cambridge. If ladies only knew how much that is graceful and imposing depends upon deep, long, flowing sleeves, they would abandon the tight fashions of the present time, and go back in this regard to the beautiful costumes which English dames wore in the days of Edwards and Henrys, and which have been universal in Japan for 2000 years. A whole book might be written about the aesthetic and social value and dignity of long sleeves. Special days are set apart in the Japanese year for the boys' and girls' festivals. The great day of the girls is March 3rd, when all the doll shops in Tokyo, Kyoto, and the other large towns are full of what are called ohina sama, models on a tiny scale of the Emperor and Empress, with their court and domestic belongings. These toy establishments are handed down from mother to daughter, and I have seen high born children playing with kina sama 300 years old and more. The special day for the boys falls on May 5th every year, when the air is full everywhere of great hollow floating fish made out of colored and gilded paper, which the wind inflates, hoisted high upon a tall bamboo pole in front of each abode where a male child has been born. The fish is the carp (koi), the universal emblem of courage and perseverance, because he swims so stoutly against the stream, and hardly consents to die when he is cut into thin slices for sashimi. In early years, and indeed until the age of 18 or 19, nothing can be too gay and brilliant for a Japanese damsel to wear. The little Nippon maids go about far outvying in splendor the great butterflies of crimson and gold, or of saffron and silver, which flit around their heads in the gardens and bamboo groves. Parental affection seems to exalt itself in devising gorgeous colors and attractive patterns for their little obi and kimono, while the jiban, or underskirt, cannot possibly be too magnificent. If these garments be only of cotton, the mother and father will have them gay, but even the poor children generally manage to wear fabrics half of silk and half of cotton, and the well to do always have their clothes composed of silk, or the beautiful silk crepe known as chirimen. This last takes the most brilliant dyes quite perfectly, and admits of very lovely decorative effects, in obtaining which nothing is feared except inharmonious combinations. You see young maidens in the streets and the temple gardens literally glittering with gold, silver, vermilion, sea green, sky blue, rose red, and orange, some wearing an upper dress covered with fans, birds, waving woods, bamboo boughs, or fish, and at a garden party given by the Princess Mori at Takanawa I was presented to a young lady, the lineal descendant of the great house of Tokugawa shoguns, whose jiban of azure silk was an embroidered pool of lotus blossoms, while her kimono of tender, creamy chirimen had on it Japanese landscapes of rising moons, rice fields, Fujiyama with the snow upon its crest, and such like. When the mature age of 20 or 21 is reached, these dazzling glories of the toilet are exchanged for sober hued dresses, gray, dove color, tea color, fawn, and brown. But even then the jiban may always be as glorious in color and patterns as fancy dictates, and the obi a splendid piece of figured satin. The attire of the boys is in every case quieter and more restrained, and elderly people cannot be clad too soberly. Japanese girls grow up to be Japanese women without change in their gentleness, docility, or good manners, and Japanese boys continue to appear attractive, candid, free from mauvaise honte, and altogether delightful, until they reach the awkward and gawky age, which for a time spoils most lads. The Japanese boy is delightful, the Japanese man is generally intelligent, polite, and, in his degree, worthy; but the Japanese youth, especially in the middle classes, is wont to prove a hobbledehoy and a social nuisance. As scholars and students they are almost faultless. There are no rules of discipline or punishment in the schools and colleges, because none are needed. The pupils are too anxious to learn, and are always in their places before the master is ready, and keen to continue work when he is tired. They are too apt to think that they know a subject when they have only commenced to understand its rudiments, and although always deferential to their sensei, the teacher, they will dictate to him, if he permits, the course of study. But a certain number of them, mingling very imperfect modern education with very crude political theories, leave their schools and colleges full of ambitions and desires which are beyond their range, and instead of accepting humble and useful walks in life, turn into detestable and dangerous agitators, whose want of sense would be contemptible if their inherited disregard of personal risk and their passionate incitement did not render them evils to be reckoned with. Those are the Soshi. Like our own young Babus of Bengal and reformers from the Indian Government College, they have got the wind of personal and political conceit in their heads, but unlike the Babus, they are not in the least timid. For want of other and better employ, they hire themselves out to unscrupulous politicians as boyish swashbucklers, to break up public meetings, intimidate nervous statesmen, dominate the voting places with noise and menace, and sometimes even to commit assault or murder. It was one of these unlovely youths who, brooding fanatically over a supposed offense against the religio loci of a temple at Ys, assassinated my enlightened and illustrious friend Viscount Mori, and another such threw the bomb which deprived Count Okuma, the Japanese Prime Minister, of a limb. The worst of them are well known to the government and the police, and when any rather exciting time is coming forward in Tokyo, and popular disturbance has to be feared, it is not unusual for the administration to clear them out of the capital by scores or hundreds, obliging them to spend a little of their ill-used leisure at Yokohama or elsewhere, until the temporary excitement has died away in the seat of the government. The outdoor games of the Japanese children are much like those of other small folks in various parts of the world, though the ingenuity of the race refines upon them. The tako, or kite, the koma, or top, the play ball, tama, the stilts, takeuma, the hoop, taga, the swing, buranko. the skipping rope, Nawakoguli, prisoner's base, O Nikko, and Oyama no Tasko, king of the castle, are just as popular, with many other familiar pastimes, in Tokyo as in London; but the natural skill and adroitness of the people improve upon the Western forms of these sports. The kites are much more scientific than ours, with long streamers at the lower corners, and strange little contrivances to produce sounds, explosions, and illuminations in the sky. Japanese tops, which will spin ever so long on a string or a knife edge, are well known; and as for Japanese ball play, there is not a little maid of 5 or 6 years in the streets who cannot keep two or three of them in the air at once with one hand, while the other holds the umbrella over the bald plate of the rocking baby. Some of their indoor games might be very well introduced among English children, being graceful and merry, yet free from boisterousness. For example, there is the pretty sport of suri kitsune, or fox catching, at which many may play at once. Somebody unwinds his or her silken sash, and ties it in a half hitch, or a reefer's knot, so as to make a running noose, of which two players hold the opposite ends, balancing the noose vertically on the floor. Then any little prize, a sweetmeat or what not, is laid on the floor on the far side of the noose, and one by one the outsiders try to snatch the object safely through the trap, the two players seeking to catch the fox's paw just as it goes into the noose. Great fun is elicited from this, and when a fox is caught, he surrenders all his prizes and takes one end of the snare. Or this is sometimes coupled with our English game of forfeits. Again there is a quiet and amusing Japanese form of blindman's buff, mi gakushi, where the fun is had with a large soft ball, not hard enough to break anything or to hurt, and the blind man, after turning round 3 times, throws this very suddenly in a direction as unexpected as possible, any person struck being obliged to take his place. Another form of migakushi is where the blind man sits on the center of a large circle made around him by the other players, after he has had his eyes covered, and he is then allowed to talk, make jokes, say anything he can to provoke a giggle or an ejaculation, so that he may specify the exact position in the circle of somebody, and oblige that one take his place. This is called ocha boji, and admits of the most charming developments. End of section 126. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC.
Section 127 of China, Japan, and the Islands of the Pacific. Read for LibriVox.org by Sonia. Islands of the Pacific. Historical Note. In the early part of the 17th century, Australia was visited by the Dutch and Spanish, and toward the end of the 18th century it was explored to some extent by Captain Cook. At this time England was in search of a place to which her criminals might be sent. New South Wales was chosen, and a penal settlement was formed. Great abuses were followed by reforms, and explorations of the country continued. In 1837 transportation to New South Wales was abolished, and convicts were sent to Van Diemen's Land, now Tasmania. This too was given up in 1853. 2 years earlier gold was discovered in Australia, and within a year 200,000 seekers for the precious metal had flocked into the country. In 1901 The Commonwealth of Australia was formed by the union of Australia and Tasmania. Australia and New Zealand are noteworthy for the wide scope of state activity. In both commonwealths the government owns and operates railways, both steam and electric, highways, telegraph and telephone lines, savings banks, and loan agencies, and has a system of old age pensions. End of section 127. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 128 of China, Japan and the Islands of the Pacific. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Son of the Exiles. The World Story, Volume 1, China, Japan and the Islands of the Pacific. Edited by Eva March Tappan. Section 128. The First Australian Colonists by W. H. Lang. In 1768, Captain James Cook was sent to the South Seas in command of an expedition to observe the transit of Venus. After this work had been accomplished, he sailed about and visited the great Southland or Australia. He touched at Botany Bay and tried to win the hearts of the savages. He almost lost his ship and ran into the stream which is still called Endeavour River to repair the damage. After many other adventures, he reached England in safety. The result of this voyage was the colonizing of Australia. The following account explains how this came to pass. The Editor. This mighty work, the colonization of Australia, began in a very humble way. Until 1775, you must know that the convicted prisoners in England were transported to North America, where they were employed as labourers by the colonists there. In this year, however, the American War broke out, and in 1783 the treaty was signed granting independence. America could no longer be a dumping ground for our criminals, and the government was looking out for some place to which they could transport this undesirable population. Cook's report of Botany Bay suggested possibilities in this direction, and it was finally agreed to make the experiment on a large scale. Anything was better than a return to the old indiscriminate executions, when a string of prisoners would be hanged before thousands of spectators every Monday morning in London alone. So an expedition was prepared which was to convey a little army of felons across almost unknown seas to the land at the very other side of the world. If you come to think of it, it was a rather grisly undertaking. There was 6 shiploads of convicts, 3 vessels full of stores for their use, an armed tender, and His Majesty's frigate Sirius. The whole expedition was under the command of Governor Arthur Phillip, a sailor, while the Sirius herself had for her captain one John Hunter. There were in all 620 male and 250 female convicts. A detachment of 208 marines was also to be shipped to keep the convicts in order, and with them 40 of their wives and a few children. What a motley crew they must have been! Some so old that they could not work, some very young. Take them as a whole, no doubt they were a shockingly bad lot. Most of them were both born and educated to crime, a few, perhaps, and God help them, innocent. With this strange company around him, Governor Phillip, as commander of the fleet, hoisted his flag on the Sirius, and on the 13th of May 1787, in the early morning, they weighed anchor from the Mother Bank in the Isle of Wight. Even as they sailed, a free pardon arrived for 2 of the prisoners, and you can imagine their feelings as they stepped on shore into England on a fine May morning, instead of sailing away across the barren seas, hopeless of any return, to a sterile and, in their eyes, a hideous land at the very ends of the earth, to be eaten perhaps by black savages. You may be sure every horrible possibility was magnified many times in the thoughts and talk of those first unwilling passengers to these lands. I have often in imagination stood on one of the ships as the fleet sailed away that morning. A fresh breeze was blowing down the channel, and although it was summer time, it was cold and bracing. There was a clear, cold horizon with sails gleaming white in the morning sun, but no smoke, as we see it now, from steamers plying to and fro. Watt was only just evolving the steam engine at that time. You can hear the boatswain's whistle, the clank of the capstan as the anchor was weighed, the chanty of the men as they hauled on the topsail halyards. Then each ship fluttered her white wings, the water whitened in foam at the bows, the land began to drop astern, and many had said good-bye to old England for ever and a day. You can see, too, what was going on below. Before you reach the hatchway, you know that there is a seething mass of humanity in the ship's carcass. Over 200 men, criminals, many with a life sentence, a collection of the greatest blackguards unhung. The ship is beginning to toss and to feel the uneasiness of a brisk passage in the channel. Many of these passengers have never been to sea before, and some are cursing, while others are groaning, the timbers are creaking, and the water is thumping and splashing at the bows. As I think of it all, somehow, I can always see the figure of one man. He is in convict dress and is holding on by a hammock, peering through the little slit which serves as the only porthole to light and ventilate the space occupied by 200 men. Here the hammocks are slung with only a foot and a half between. He has a bad face. The black hair is close cropped, the chin clean shaven, but the moustache, beard and whiskers are showing blue against his sallow skin. He has grey eyes set wide apart, a straight nose with delicate nostrils, upper lip long and the lower undershot, and his teeth are white and strong. The hand that steadies him is the hand of a gentleman. As he looks at the shore slipping away, the eyes for one moment soften and gleam with tears, and then with an oath and a hard laugh they relapse into the cruel devil-may-care look, tinged with cunning when a warder or parson appears. I always see this fellow and wonder who he is. One who has had the opportunities and passed them by, no doubt. The mother who bore him would not know him now. Let us hope that she may never know his fate. As the mind travels ahead, I can see him with a dull, sulky, dazed face, taking his place beneath a beam from which a rope is hanging down in the new land to which they are all travelling, and soon it is all over. A horrid subject, but true. So away sailed the first settlers, and the breeze grew to a favourable gale, and they made fair weather of it, until in 3 days they were on the broad Atlantic, and their escort, the Hyena, left them and returned to Portsmouth with the news that all was well. But so boisterous was it that Governor Phillip could write no dispatches to take home. Nor could they have transshipped it if he had written. The only ill news that the Hyena brought was that a mutiny had broken out in the Scarborough among the convicts, but it had been quelled, and the ringleaders, the chief of whom was the man whom I have described to you, punished. They made a comparatively uneventful voyage of it, calling it Rio and the Cape. We should think the voyage an insufferably long one now. From May the 13th to June the 3rd, they were between the Isle of Wight and Tenerife. At this island they remained a week, watering and laying in fresh food, and here a miserable man, a convict, escaped in a small boat, but was quickly captured. Poor devil! His back smarted, you may be sure, for his last throw for liberty. Up to this time 21 convicts and 3 children had died, and we wonder from what cause. From June the 10th to August the 6th, the fleet was sailing between Tenerife and Rio. during a similar period we could now almost accomplish the voyage from London to Melbourne and back. They again weighed anchor on September the 4th, and had a prosperous and quite rapid passage to the Cape of Good Hope, which was reached on October the 13th. After laying in a stock of provisions and 500 head of livestock on November the 12th, they once more set sail. For 13 days they made such little headway, only 240 miles, that Governor Phillip transshipped from the frigate Sirius into the tender Supply, in order that he might push ahead and make preparations for landing. But from this date favourable breezes blew with such force that in 40 days the land of New South Wales was sighted, and on the 10th of January 1788 the Supply cast anchor in Botany Bay. Before 3 days had passed, the remainder of the fleet had arrived, and they all anchored within the bay. Since embarkation at Spithead, they had lost by death on board the fleet 1 marine, 1 marine's wife and child, 36 male, 4 female convicts, and 5 children. On landing, an epidemic of dysentery broke out, and by June the 20th the total deaths among the convicts had run up to 81 since leaving England, and there were 52 unfit for labour on account of old age and infirmities. One wonders how on earth old men like that were sent so far away to found a colony. But such as they were, here they were at last, every ship of the fleet all anchored in Botany Bay, with a wonderfully clean bill of health, 252 days from Spithead. It was a fine accomplishment in those days, and Governor Phillip doubtless slept sound that night when the last cable had rattled out and the last anchor had fallen with a splash into the shallow waters of Botany Bay. Botany Bay proved a disappointing place to land at. What was a fine harbour for Cook's little ship was but a poor refuge for a dozen. The country round was very bare and barren, and looked swampy and unhealthy, while the water supply was limited. Phillip, however, was not a man to sit still. The last of his transports had arrived on January the 20th, and by the 22nd he was off with 3 boats northward to find some better landing place. He had not far to go. 3 leagues along the coast was a boat harbour, so marked by Captain Cook, but which the great explorer had not had time to visit. He had only seen its entrance from the Endeavour's deck while sailing past. Through the narrow heads, with their steep rocks on either hand, Phillip and 3 boats glided on the forenoon of January the 24th. And you know now what he saw: a deep winding harbour and innumerable coves, all with water enough to hold quite easily the fleet awaiting it in Botany Bay. Well-wooded shores there were, and water for the drawing, birds innumerable, herbage and flowers. It was very beautiful, and to one particular cove where the water was deepest and where a little brook ran down, Phillip determined to fetch his fleet and disembark his crews. For 2 days he explored the windings of the harbour, and found no spot more favourable than this his first love. So he named it Sydney Cove, after the minister, Viscount Sydney, and in his dispatch he remarked that here 1,000 ships could ride at anchor with ease. So was founded and named the town of Sydney, the 8th largest city of the Empire. End of section 128. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Son of the Exiles. Section 129 of China, Japan and the Islands of the Pacific. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Son of the Exiles. The World Story, Volume 1, China, Japan and the Islands of the Pacific. Edited by Eva March Tappan. Section 129. Gold, Gold, Gold by W. H. Lang. Australia had been having a bad time of it in the 40s. What with droughts, the low price of stock, the slow growth of population, and the fact that the market for her produce lay so very, very far away from the thickly populated countries of the Old World, things were not looking very bright. And in 1849, by the merest chance, gold was found in California, and found too by a New South Wales man. He was deepening a mill race when he saw in the water glowing particles large enough to pick up with his fingers. He knew that it was gold, but he did not know how to win it, and had not an old Georgian miner been there, the discovery might even have lapsed into obscurity. Before 1849 there were only a few thousand inhabitants in the great state of California. Then all the riff-raff of the old countries turned their faces to the west, and a great crowd streamed away, their eyes burning and glowing in the desire for the wealth which they believed would lie at their feet when they reached the new land. From Australia, too, a crowd rushed away to the east to join that which was rolling to the west from Europe, and our population became even thinner than it had been before. And amongst those emigrants from Sydney was one man called Edward Hammond Hargraves. He shipped with many others in a vessel called the Elizabeth Archer, and arrived in San Francisco to find the whole of the great bay besides the town a forest of masts. The whole world seemed to be flocking there, and Hargraves joined the crowd. But if for 20 years fortune had not smiled upon him in New South Wales, neither yet did she seem to be any more kind in California. Yet, although he won no more gold than was sufficient to keep him going, he was an observant fellow, a practical geologist in a rough way, and a man of character, industrious and determined. As he worked away in the California gullies and saw the nature of the country, it began to take possession of his mind that he had seen exactly like formations in the land which he had just left, the same geological strata, and the same combination of deposits which led the experienced to say, "Here is gold." His companions laughed at his theories, but he was deeply in earnest, and he hankered day and night to be at home again. He had arrived in San Francisco in 1849. He sailed in the barque Emma in January 1851, and, like all true Australians who think there is no country in the world like their own, was glad to be at home again. Hargraves made no secret of his theories either on the voyage or on his arrival in Sydney, but he was laughed at as a crank. Gold in Australia? Pooh, pooh! The man was mad. And yet gold had already been won there. Away far back in the time of Governor Phillip, a convict had produced a piece of gold which he said he had found. He could discover no more, and got a flogging for his pains as an impostor and a liar. Sir Roderick Murchison, the geologist, had written papers showing that in the geological formation portions of Australia resembled the diggings in the Urals. Count Strzelecki, who pioneered Gippsland, had found an auriferous iron ore, but not likely to be payable, and it was known that a man had picked up a nugget several ounces in weight on the Fish River in 1830. Then there were all sorts of rumours of how convict shepherds had made themselves rich by selling gold to the Jews in Sydney, and there was no doubt that one old fellow called McGregor from time to time took parcels of gold to the city and sold them there. Hargraves knew all these things, and he could not rest for a moment after landing in Sydney. He hired a horse and set out early in February across the Blue Mountains. It was a lonesome, desolate ride through a barren, sterile country, but after being lost once, he arrived on the 4th day at a little inn, kept by a widow woman named Lister, at Guyong. He was nearly in the country now which he had had in his mind's eye all through his California wanderings, and he was in a high state of excitement, you may be sure. He took Mrs. Lister into his confidence and she, as most women would have been, was fairly bitten by the scheme and the prospects that Hargraves held out to her. When asked to find a black boy as a guide, she at once offered the services of her own son, who knew every inch of the country all around for many miles. They started away from the inn on the 12th of February in bright early autumn weather, after a dry summer, and in very few miles Hargraves recognised the old spots on the banks of a creek. It was here that his mind had always pictured for him the discovery of untold treasures of gold. But the creek was dry at the place, and while his guide searched for water, Hargraves unwillingly sat down to take a hasty meal. Then the boy returned with the news that he had found a water hole in the creek bed. The horses were hobbled and allowed to stray away, and the grand experiment was begun. Hargraves scratched the gravel off a schistose dyke, which ran across the creek at right angles, and then with a trowel he dug a panful of the earth which lay upon the rock and ran with it to the water so as to wash it in his dish. You have never washed a dish full of earth, I suppose? It is a most exciting sport, I assure you. You have a tin dish with a little rim looking inwards, and there are 2 or 3 rings running round the body of the basin. You put your spadeful of earth into this, and then, sitting on your haunches by the waterside, you dip the earth and the dish into the water and quickly wash away all the light soil. Then there is left, after some time, only the gravel, and this you gradually get rid of by swaying the basin backwards and forwards, causing the water contained in it to go round and round like a little maelstrom, until there is left only the larger, heavier portions and some heavy mineralized sand. Then you pick out the big pieces of quartzy gravel, making them to rasp pleasantly on the tin, and you throw them to one side. And as you wash, the water grows clearer and clearer, and the sand leaves a tail behind it as the water sweeps it around your dish. And then in the tail you see, gleaming, dull and warm, not glittering, but glowing rather, the unmistakable, unspeakable, soul-stirring virgin gold. So it was with Hargraves. Down there in the lonely gullies by the creek side he washed dish after dish of soil, and in each lay the little particles, those treasures which had been hidden from the eyes of man ever since the beginning of time. It was enough to make a man lose his head, and for a moment, indeed, as he tells us himself, he did go mad. "I shall be made a baronet," he called out to his guide. "You will be knighted, and the old horse stuffed and put in the British Museum." And his innocent companion believed him. It is curious that Hargraves' mind did not seem to run on acquiring untold wealth by his discovery. I think I should have liked to go and dig and wash and wash and dig until I had acquired enough of the stuff to buy a principality, and then have gone and told the authorities all about it. What do you think you would have done? But Hargraves wished to be made a baronet, of all things, and have his horse stuffed. And so what did he do? He proved about 70 miles of country to be gold-bearing. He saw £10,000 raised in a week to the surface, and he called the place Ophir. Then he hastened back to Sydney, and bargained that the government should give him £10,000 down as a reward for his great discovery. This was agreed to, and they also made him Commissioner of the Goldfields, a not very lucrative post. And with this he was contented. But, as he himself tells, had he asked for 10 shillings for every £100 worth of gold won for the first 3 years, it would not have been considered excessive. And by the bargain he would have become the possessor of several hundred thousands of pounds. And that is the story of how gold was first found in Australia. The Australian diggings became the magnet which seemed to be attracting the whole earth. Even our own towns were deserted. Servants were not to be had at any wage. Doctors, lawyers, shoeblacks, coach builders, butchers and bakers, everybody rushed away to the diggings, eager to be rich. The newspapers were full of nothing else but gold, news sheets and advertisements. Parramatta, a suburb of Sydney, was absolutely depopulated. It was a mad time. When Hargreaves had completed his bargain with government, he again started out on horseback for the fields. He found a stream of people going both ways, out to the diggings and back again. Those going out were full of hope and fire, their faces shining like those travellers in the Pilgrim's Progress who were going up to the Golden City. Those coming back were moving along slowly, sullen and sulky, beaten. It was like the two streams of fighters which eye-witnesses described as going up and down Spion Kop in the Boer War. Those disappointed ones were vowing a terrible vengeance on him who had deceived them, as they called it. Hargreaves did not tell them who he was, but at a ferry, where numbers had to wait their turn to be taken over, having first mounted his horse, he made a speech to the discontented, pointing out how and why they had failed. It was as well that he had been wise enough to mount his horse before he disclosed his name. The crowd would have lynched him. They were a motley crew, both coming and going. There was even a blind man being led by a lame one. The cripple extended his hand over his crutch, and the blind one held it, and so they went off with the best of them, all athirst for gold. There was no difficulty in finding your way. The roads were full of passengers of every kind, on foot, on horseback, in drays and wagons, all sorts, and when you at length reached the land of promise, it was a picturesque sight. As you topped the last hill in the ranges, the mining township lay at your feet, all made of canvas tents or of wood huts. The creek on which the gold was being won wound at the feet of thickly timbered hills, and every here and there was joined by a gully from the mountains. The smoke was rising blue in the distance, and from far down beneath you arose a constant rumble and hum like distant thunder. It was the noise of the cradles. Then, as evening fell, the lights of innumerable fires began to twinkle through the darkness, the rumble of the cradles ceased, and after a while the township slept. All over the country towns like this sprang up, and not only at the site of the first rush, but away down in Victoria, where the wealth of gold soon eclipsed that found in New South Wales. In a few months there were collected at Ballarat and Mount Alexander alone between 20,000 and 30,000 men, and the total population of the colony only came to a scant 200,000, and it took months before the news reached the Old World, and the thronging thousands began to arrive by the shipload. One writer at this time, in reference to this distance from home, says, "The clipper Phoenician, one of the most beautiful ships I ever saw, reached Plymouth on the 3rd, having made the unprecedentedly quick passage of 83 days. There was no cable girdling the earth in 40 seconds then, and letters took 83 days at the quickest in transit. Now they are delivered punctually to the hour in 30, and the wickets as they fall in an international cricket match in London are printed in the next morning's Argus in Melbourne, 12,000 miles away. And then the gold came pouring into the great towns on the seaboard for shipment home. There were tons of it, and I mean it literally when I write tons of it. Hargreaves had washed his little spadefuls of earth in February. The rush had begun in April. From November the 2nd to the 30th of that month, the gold carried from Ballarat to Melbourne and Geelong by the government escort alone weighed 2 tons and a half, and this was believed to be only 1/3 of the whole amount raised in this district alone. In 1 month, from one locality, 7 tons of pure virgin native gold. It was worth at the lowest £3.10 an ounce. When you look at it this way, you can have but little wonder that the whole country went mad. And in those days it was so easily found. In many places the precious stuff simply lay on the surface in what are called nuggets. There are plenty of these yet if we had eyes to see and knew where to look for them, but 50 years ago these nuggets were comparatively common. Here, for instance, is the story of one particularly big find. It was a few months after the first discovery had taken place at Ophir in the Bathurst district. The first tremendous excitement had died out, and then there appeared one morning in the Bathurst newspaper the big headlines of "Bathurst Gone Mad Again." And it was little wonder. A Dr. Kerr had a station at a place called Wallawaugh. He and his wife had been very kind to the blacks, and they had several of them employed as shepherds and workers on the run. One afternoon a black fellow who had been shepherding sheep came in and told the doctor he had found a big lump of gold far out on the place. Gold was of no use to him, but he had heard much talk about it and knew how the white man valued the dross. The doctor mounted his horse and took a hammer and a saddle-bag. There it lay, open to the view of any man who might pass that way. No wonder if the sheep's teeth that had nibbled round it had been filled with gold. At his feet the doctor saw a mass of gold and quartz which weighed over 100 weight. 4,860 pounds worth was his for the trouble of a day's ride. It is told that on the journey home the doctor had to stop at some outlying house, and he had no wish that the nature of the packet in his saddle-bag should be known. He flung it carelessly down beside the fence as he dismounted from his horse. "That's heavy," said the owner of the house. "Ah, my word," replied the doctor, "it might be gold." And the curious part of this discovery was that nowhere near the spot where the 100-weight had lain could any more gold be found. Even the earth from the vicinity, when washed, yielded not one grain, not a tiny speck. But with gold to be won by the ton, and with hundreds weight lying on the surface, so that you might make them your pillow as you lay back and smoked your after-dinner pipe whilst you were watching the sheep, it is no wonder that the gold fever spread like the measles or influenza, and that the whole community lost their heads. As ship after ship came sailing in and discharged its load of immigrants, the sailors used to bolt away as the anchor fell, leaving their officers in despair to work their vessels as they might. What wild, strange times they were! End of section 129. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Son of the Exiles.
Section 130 of China, Japan, and the Islands of the Pacific. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jim Locke of Floyd, Virginia. The World's Story, Volume 1, China, Japan, and the Islands of the Pacific, edited by Eva March Tappan. Section 130, The Missionary and the Cannibals, by Reginald Horsley. New Zealand was visited by the navigators Tasman and Cook. The island is one of the British colonial possessions, and in 1907 it took the name of the Dominion of New Zealand. The Editor. The taste which the Maori had acquired for wandering outside their own country at length brought about a remarkable conjunction, destined to bear most importantly upon the future of New Zealand. It was nothing else than the formation of a friendship between a Christian Englishman of singular nobility of character and a Maori of sanguinary disposition, a warrior notable among a race of warriors, and withal a cannibal of cannibals. In the first decade of the years when George III was king, there was born in Yorkshire a boy who was brought up as a blacksmith. For some time he followed his trade, but having a strong inclination towards a missionary life, he was ordained a clergyman of the Church of England, and in due time found himself senior chaplain of the colony of New South Wales. This man, whose name must ever be honored in the history of New Zealand, was Samuel Marsden, who was the first to desire to bring, and who did actually bring, the tidings of the gospel to the land of the Maori. There were missionaries at work in Tahiti, in the Marquesas, and in Tonga, but New Zealand, the land of the ferocious warrior and savage cannibal, had been esteemed an impossible country, or at all events as not yet prepared for the sowing, so it was left to itself. Then came a day when Samuel Marsden, walking through the narrow streets of Sydney, stopped to gaze at a novel sight. Not far from him stalked proudly three splendid-looking men, types of a race with which he was unfamiliar. They were not Australian aboriginals. That was instantly evident. Their faces were strangely scarred, their heads, held high, were plumed with rare feathers, and the outer garment they wore, of some soft buff material, suggested the Roman toga. There was indeed something Roman about their appearance, with their fine features, strong noses, and sternly compressed lips. Mr. Marsden was from the first strongly attracted to these men, and being informed that they were New Zealand chiefs, come on a visit to Sydney, the good man grew sad. That such noble-looking men should be heathen and cannibals inexpressibly shocked him, and he determined then and there that what one of God's servants might do for the salvation of that proud intellectual race, that by the grace of God he would do. A man so deeply religious as Samuel Marsden was not likely to waste time over a matter in his judgment so supremely important. The chiefs readily admitted the anarchy induced by the constant friction between brown men and white, though it was not to be expected that they should realize at once their own spiritual darkness. Mr. Marsden was not discouraged, and set in train a scheme whereby a number of missionaries were to be sent out immediately by the Church Missionary Society to attempt the conversion of the Maori to Christianity. 25 of these reached Sydney, where men's ears were tingling with the awful details of the massacre of the Boyd, and judged the risk too great, so they stayed where they were, and the conversion of New Zealand was delayed for a season. The residence of meek and peaceable men among such intractable savages was deemed to be outside the bounds of possibility, but Marsden firmly believed that the way would be opened in God's good time, and waited and watched and prayed, possessing his soul in patience. The opportunity which he so confidently expected arrived in 1814. Some 10 years after the birth of Samuel Marsden, another boy was born on the other side of the world. Hongi Ika was his name, a chief and a chief's son of the great tribe of the Nagapuhi in the north. Marsden had swung his hammer over the glowing iron and beaten out horseshoes and plowshares. Hongi, too, swung his hammer, but it was the hammer of Thor, and every time that Hongi's hammer fell, it beat out brains and broke men's bones, until none could be found to stand against him. Yet Hongi had a hard knock or two now and then, and being as yet untravelled, gladly assented when his friend Ruatara, who had seen King George of England, suggested a visit to Sydney. Hongi found plenty to interest him, and also took a philosopher's delight in arguing the great questions of religion with Mr. Marsden, in whose house he and Ruatara abode. Marsden knew the man for what he was, a warrior and a cannibal, but so tactful and persuasive was he that, before his visit ended, Hongi agreed to allow the establishment of a missionary settlement at the Bay of Islands, and promised it his protection. So the first great step was taken, and Marsden planted his vineyard. He was a wise man, and knowing by report the shortcomings of the land he desired to Christianize, took with him a good supply of animal food, and provision for future needs as well, in the shape of sheep and oxen. With a view to the requirements of his lieutenants, he also introduced a horse or two. What impression the sight of a man on horseback made upon the Maori may be gathered from the experience of Mr. Edward Wakefield 27 years later at Whanganui. In this district, which is on the opposite side of the island to that on which Mr. Marsden landed, and considerably farther south, the natives had never seen a horse. Result: they fled, writes Mr. Wakefield, in all directions, and as I galloped past those who were running, they fairly lay down on their faces and gave themselves up for lost. I dismounted, and they plucked up courage to come and take a look at the kuri nui, or large dog. "Can he talk?" said one. "Does he like boiled potatoes?" said another, and a third, "Mustn't he have a blanket to lie down on at night?" This unbounded respect and adoration lasted all the time that I remained. A dozen hands were always offering him Indian corn, maize, and grass, and sow thistles when they learned what he really did eat, and a wooden bowl of water was kept constantly replenished close to him, and little knots of curious observers sat round the circle of his tether rope, remarking and conjecturing and disputing about the meaning and intention of every whisk of his tail or shake of his ears. It was for long all endeavour and little result. But other missionaries arrived. New stations were erected in various parts of the north, and the Wesleyans 7 years later imitated the example of the Church Missionary Society and sent their contingent to the front. To the fighting line these went, indeed, for they settled at Whangaroa, where the sunken hull of the Boyd recalled the horror of 12 years before. Tara himself was still there, the memory of his stripes as green as though he had but yesterday endured the poignant suffering. He rendered vain for 5 long years the efforts of the missionaries, and from his very deathbed cursed them, urging his tribe to drive them out, so that they fled, thankful to escape with their lives, for they saved naught else. If Mr. Marsden hoped to turn the philosopher, warrior, cannibal from the error of his ways, the good man must have been grievously disappointed. Hongi remained a pagan, but he never broke his promise to the missionary. He was a terrible fellow, but he was not a liar. His word was sacred, and he regretted on his deathbed that the men of Whangaroa had been too strong for him when they drove the West missionaries from their station. Leaving Mr. Marsden and his colleagues at Rangihoa, Hongi returned to his trade of war, and for 5 years or so enjoyed himself in his own way. Then, tiring again of strife, his thoughts turned once more upon foreign travel. This time his ambition soared high, and with a fellow chief he sailed for London under the wing of a missionary. He was exceedingly well received, for the horror and fright with which the New Zealanders had been regarded was greatly diminished in 1821, and Britons were again looking longingly towards a country so rich in commercial possibilities. So Hongi found himself a lion, and with the adaptability of his race so comported himself that it occurred to few to identify the bright-eyed little fellow with the ample forehead and keen brain with the lusty warrior and ferocious cannibal of whom startling tales had been told. Even His Majesty George IV did not disdain to receive the Napoleon of New Zealand, and being perhaps in a prophetic mood, presented the great little man with a suit of armour. Hongi would have preferred a present of the offensive kind in the shape of guns and ammunition, for the Nga Puhi had early gauged the value of such weapons in settling tribal disputes, and had managed to acquire a few, though not nearly enough to meet the views of Hongi Ika. The king had set the fashion, and his subjects followed suit so lavishly that if Hongi had chosen to lay aside his dignity and open a curio shop, He could have done so. The little man was overjoyed. He was rich now, and he gloated over his presents as a means to an end. What a war he could wage if he could only find a pretext! Pretexts did not, as a rule, trouble Hongi, but the eyes of the great were upon him, and it would be just as well to consider appearances. As he recrossed the ocean, his active brain was at work, planning. Ah, if he could but find a pretext! Hongi had been absent for 2 years, and with right good will the tribes of the northeast wished that he might never return. However, with the dominant personality of the little man lacking to the all-conquering Nga Puhi, there was no knowing what might happen. So the tribes around about the Thames River, whose frith is that thing of beauty, the Haraki Gulf, took heart of grace, marched to the fight, and slew among other folk no less a person than Hongi's son-in-law. Here was indeed a pretext. Hongi clung to it as a dog to his bone. In Sydney he had melted down, so to speak, his great pile of presents into 300 stand of arms, which included a goodly share of the coveted tupara, or double-barreled guns. Ammunition was added, and thus, with a very arsenal at his command, Hongi Ika came again to his native land. He came armed cap a pie, for he wore the armour which the king had given him, and the good Mihonari stood aghast at sight of him. "Even now the tribes are fighting," they groaned. "When is this bitter strife to cease?" Pretext indeed! To avenge his son-in-law was all very well. Utu should be exacted to the full, but here was a pretext beyond all others, and the wily Hongi instantly seized upon it. "Fighting, are they?" He grinned as only a Maori can grin. "I will stop these dogs in their worrying. They shall have their fill of fighting." He grinned again. "That will be the surest way, my Mihonari friends. I will keep them fighting until they have no more stomach for it, and so shall there be an end." He muttered under his breath, "because their tribe shall be even as the moa." As the moa was extinct, the significance of the addition should be sufficiently clear. Hongi kept his word. He always did that, and sailed for the front in the proudest of his fleet of war canoes, with 1,000 warriors behind him, armed with mare and patu and spear, while in his van went a garde du corps of 300 picked men, fondling, so pleased were they, the 300 muskets and tupara, for which their chief's presents had been exchanged. Southward through the Haraki Gulf he sails into the estuary of the Thames, into the Thames itself. One halt, and the Totara Pa is demolished, and with 500 of its defenders dead in his rear, Hongi sweeps on southward still to Matakitaki. 4 to 1 against him. What care Hongi Ika and his 300 musketeers? It is the same story: fierce attack and sudden victory, ruthless slaughter of twice 1,000 foes, and Hongi, grinning in triumph, ever keeps his face to the south and drives his enemies before him as far as the lake of Rotorua. Hongi, when in battle, as a rule shone resplendent in the armour which George IV had given him, and which was supposed to render him invulnerable. The belief received justification from the issue of Hongi's last fight at Hokianga in 1827. For some reason the great chief wore only his helmet upon that fatal day. Ill fared it then with Roderick Dhu, when on the field his targe he threw. Ill fared it with Hongi when he rushed into the fight without his shining breastplate, for hardly was the battle joined when a bullet passed through his body, and the day of the great Hongi, the Lion of the North, was done. 15 months later, as he lay upon his death mats at Wangaroa, feasting his glazing eyes upon the array of clubs, battle axes, muskets, and tupars set around the bed, he called to him his relatives, his dearest friends, and his fighting chiefs, and spoke to them this word: "Children, And you who have carried my arms to victory, this is my word to you. I promised long ago to be kind to the Mihonari, and I have kept my promise. It is not my fault if they have not been well treated by others. Do as I have done. Let them dwell in peace, for they do no harm, and some good. Hear ye this word also. The ends of the world draw together, and men of a strong race come ever over the sea to this our land. Let these likewise dwell in peace. Trade with them. Give them your daughters in marriage. Good shall come of it. But if there come over the sea men in red coats, who neither sow nor reap, but ever carry arms in their hands, beware of them. Their trade is war, and they are paid to kill. Make you war upon them, and drive them out, otherwise evil will come of it. Children, and you, my old comrades, be brave and strong in your country's cause. Let not the land of your ancestors pass into the hands of the Pakeha white men. Behold, I have spoken. With that the mighty chief Hongi drew the corner of his mat across his face, and passed through the gates to the waters of Ranga, the abode of the shades. 22 years from that Christmas day, when Samuel Marsden preached his first sermon in a land where Christianity was not even a name, 4,000 Maori converts knelt in the house of God. The Editor. End of section 130. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Jim Locke of Floyd, Virginia.
Section 131 of China, Japan, and the Islands of the Pacific. Read for LibriVox.org by Thomas Peter. Hot water basins, New Zealand. Photograph, page 502. The scenery of some parts of New Zealand is wildly beautiful. There are rugged mountain chains, with precipices and deep ravines. There are volcanoes and hot springs, and snow-covered summits. There are great glaciers coming close down to the shore, and long re-entrant fjords. The illustration shows the famous White Terraces before their destruction by a neighboring volcano in 1886. These terraces were high, wide-rippled stairways of sinter, smooth and hard. In places they swelled out as umbrella buttresses. In their floors were warm baths, into which tourists and resident Maoris delighted to plunge. Over them hung clouds of steam, and under them raged a heat that I found still strongly evident. A wild bit of the mountain scenery of New Zealand has been thus described. And now you are out among the great granite boulders upon the river's brink. And why? What is this? Of the opposite bank, up and still straight up, your climbing eye must go, following the perpendicular bush that climbs so sheer, and suddenly from the riverbed up to a height of near 3,000 feet, and past the bush, and still straight up, to the belt of scant gold grass and the bare grey crags above, and up, 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 beyond them still, with your head bent back and your senses all confounded, to the glorious blue and white of a giant glacier, and pure serrated snows upon the sky. You are looking at one of the sides of the river valley. It does not slope, and it is some 6,000 feet in height. The other, perhaps 1/2 mile away, is equally high and just as sheer, and presently, as the track ascends and the trees lessen, frowning, white-tipped walls begin to draw together, the valley becomes a canyon, and you realize that you are walking in a gigantic furrow of the earth, something like the Lauterbrunnen Thal, but more stupendous, and very much more beautiful. End of section 131. This recording is in the public domain.
Section 132 of China, Japan, and the Islands of the Pacific. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Betty B. The World's Story, Volume 1, China, Japan, and the Islands of the Pacific, edited by Eva March Tappan. Section 132. The Story of Pitcairn Island by Anonymous. In December 1787, a ship named the Bounty sailed from England for the South Seas. Her captain, William Bligh, proved to be so brutal a tyrant that the mate, Fletcher Christian, and others mutinied, seized the ship, and set the captain and 18 companions adrift in an open boat, provided with tools, food, and some few instruments of navigation. This boat finally reached Timor Island, and the men were sent to England. The mutineers made their way to Tahiti, but fearing that an English man of war would be sent in pursuit of them, they, their native wives, and friends removed to a lonely island of which they had heard, called Pitcairn Island. The Editor. In 1808 the whale ship Topaz, of Boston, Captain Folger, chanced to be cruising near a rocky islet, upon the shore of which the surf was breaking so furiously that it seemed inaccessible. A canoe was seen putting off through the breakers, and the occupants hailed the ship, offering in good English their services if any one wished to land. One of the sailors volunteered to go ashore in the canoe. He soon came back with a strange report. The first man whom he met on the island said his name was Alexander Smith, and that he was the sole survivor of the crew of the Bounty, that including himself there were now 35 persons on the island. Captain Folger then went ashore, received some further information, and in return told the islanders something of what had happened in the world for the last score of years. How there had been a revolution in France, how there was a man named Bonaparte who had become emperor, how there had been great wars, and England had won glorious victories on the sea. Upon hearing this, the islanders broke into a loud hurrah, exclaiming, "Old England forever!" Captain Folger returned to his ship, made a note in his logbook, and upon reaching Valparaiso furnished an account of what he had seen, which was duly forwarded to England. But just then the British government had matters of more importance on hand than to attend to the case of a few people on a lonely island upon the other side of the globe. So the curtain which had been lifted for a moment fell again for another 6 years, when it was raised by accident. In 1814 the frigates Britain, Captain Staines, and Tagus, Captain Pippon, were cruising in the Pacific in search of the American sloop of war Essex, which had captured several British whalers. As evening fell, they suddenly came in sight of a small but lofty island, 200 miles from where, according to their charts, any island ought to have been. They looked at their charts; no island was there. They looked to sea, and there the island certainly was, rising sheer up 1,000 feet from the water's edge. Morning broke, and there still stood the island, and groups of people were standing on the rocks. Presently 2 men were seen launching a canoe, into which they sprang and paddled to the ships. "Won't you heave us a rope now?" was the cheery hail. This was done, and a tall young man of 25 sprang on board. "Who are you?" was the question. "I am Thursday October Christian, son of Fletcher Christian, the mutineer, by a Tahitian mother, and the firstborn on this island." The other, a young man of 18, was Edward Young, son of another of the mutineers of whom we have spoken. The young men were full of wonder at what they saw. A cow astonished and perhaps frightened them a little. Goats and pigs were the only animals they had ever seen. A little dog pleased them greatly. "I know that's a dog," said Edward. "I have read of such things." Captain Staines ordered refreshments to be prepared for them in his cabin. Before sitting down they folded their hands and asked a blessing, which they repeated at the close of the meal. They had been taught to do this, they said, by their pastor, John Adams, for it appears that Alexander Smith went also by this name, which we shall hereafter give him. The 2 captains went on shore and climbed the steep ascent to the village, where the whole community, headed by John Adams and his blind wife, were waiting to receive them. He was something past 50, stout and healthy in appearance, though with a careworn expression of countenance. He stood, hat in hand, smoothing his grey locks, as he had been wont, sailor fashion, to do a quarter of a century ago when addressing his officers. On being assured that no harm should happen to him, he told the story of what had occurred since the Bounty disappeared. The narrative runs thus: For 2 months the Bounty cruised about in search of Pitcairn Island. When at last they discovered it, the vessel was dismantled, every movable article, even to the planks from her sides, taken ashore. Fire was then set to the hull, and the charred remains sunk in 25 fathoms of water. The arable part of the island was then divided into equal shares among the 9 whites, the Tahitians being evidently considered almost as slaves. Kristin himself, apprehending that he would be followed even to his lonely retreat, found a cave far up the mountainside, where he kept a stock of provisions, and spent much of his time gazing over the waste of waters, watching for the dreaded appearance of a sail, and reading a Bible and prayer book. For 2 or 3 years everything went on prosperously. Then the wife of Williams was killed by falling over the rocks. He undertook to take the wife of one of the Tahitians, whose comrades formed a plot to murder all the Englishmen. The plot was discovered and revealed by the wives of the whites. 2 of the Tahitians fled to the mountains, where they were killed by the others, to whom pardon had been offered if they would do so. Meantime 2 of the men, Quintal and McCoy, had succeeded in distilling alcohol from a root, were constantly drunk and abusive toward the natives, who again determined to murder all the whites. 5. Kristin, Mills, Williams, Martin, and Brown were killed on the spot. Smith fled, severely wounded, down the rocks, but the Tahitians promised to spare his life if he would return. Young was hidden by the women, with whom he was a favorite. Quintal and McCoy fled to the mountains, where they remained until summoned back, peace having apparently been restored. But the whites felt that their only security lay in the death of the natives. They fell upon them by surprise and killed them all. Soon, however, McCoy, while drunk, fell over the rocks, and Quintal became so outrageous that Adams and Young killed him in self-defense. These 2 were the sole survivors of the 15 men who had 7 years before landed upon the island. How and when occurred the great change which took place in these 2 men is not told. All that is told is that they sought out the Bible and prayer book of Kristin, and entered upon a most religious life. Young died of asthma in 1800, not, however, until he had instructed Adams, who could barely read and not write, and he, the sole man on the island, became the guardian and instructor of a community of more than a score of women and young children. As the children grew up, they were married by Adams, according to the form laid down in the prayer book, the ring used for all having been made by him. The son of Kristin took for wife the widow of Edward Young, a woman quite old enough to be his mother, and so became stepfather to the tall young man, almost of his own age, who accompanied him on his visit to the British ship. If the islanders were astonished at the visitors, the latter were no less amazed at the aspect of this little community. The island, apparently about 12 miles in circuit, rose to the height of 1,000 feet, the steep cliffs down to the water's edge being clothed with palm, banyan, coconut, and breadfruit trees, while in the valleys were plantations of taro root, yams, and sweet potatoes. The village, which consisted of 5 houses, that being the number of families, was situated on a level platform high above the ocean, shaded with broad-leaved bananas and plantains. The houses were of wood, 2 stories in height, each having its pig pen, poultry house, bakery, and another for the manufacture of tapa, the substitute for cloth, a kind of paper made by pounding together layers of the inner bark of trees. The population now numbered 46. The young men, all born on the island, were finely formed, tall, the average height being 5 feet 10 inches, some of them exceeding 6 feet. The young women were also tall. One, not the tallest, was 5 feet 10 inches. All had white teeth and profuse black hair, neatly dressed and ornamented with wreaths of flowers. Their features were of a decidedly European cast, the complexion being a clear brunette. Their dress consisted of a loose bodice reaching from waist to knees, with a sort of mantle thrown over the shoulder and reaching to the ankles, which was thrown aside when at work. Their feet were bare. The young people were then mostly unmarried, for Adams discouraged very early marriages, as the girls would then necessarily be occupied with the care of their children, and he also inculcated upon the young men the necessity of having made some provision for a family before entering into any matrimonial engagement. The older women were mainly occupied in making tapa. The younger worked in the fields with their fathers and brothers. Their strength and agility astonished their visitors. One of them, says Captain Pipon, accompanied us to the boat, carrying on her shoulders as a present a large basket of yams, over such roads and precipices as were scarcely passable by any creatures except goats, and over which we could scarcely scramble with the help of our hands. Yet with this load on her shoulders she skipped from rock to rock like a young roe. In 1856 the whole people removed from Pitcairn to Norfolk, a much larger and pleasanter island. Their love for their first home was strong, however, and at length a number of families returned. In 1890 they celebrated the 100th anniversary of the arrival of the Bounty at Pitcairn. The Editor. End of section 132. Section 133 of China, Japan, and the Islands of the Pacific. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Betty B. The World's Story, Volume 1, China, Japan, and the Islands of the Pacific, edited by Eva March Tappan. Section 133. The Last Voyage of Captain Cook, by Charles C. B. Seymour. The Hawaiian, formerly known as the Sandwich Islands, were discovered by Captain Cook in 1778, and there the great navigator met his death. In 1820 American missionaries went to the islands, and in 20 years the speech of the natives had been reduced to writing, schools and courts of justice had been organized, and the irresponsible rule of the king had been limited by a constitution. In 1893 the attempts of Queen Liliuokalani to claim more authority than was granted by the old constitution resulted in her deposition, and in 1894 a republic was established. In 1898 the islands were, at their own request, annexed to the United States, and 2 years later they became a territory of that country. The Editor. Cook's third and last voyage was undertaken for the purpose of discovering a supposed northwest passage from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. Numerous expeditions had been sent out for this purpose at various times, but they had all failed. It was resolved by the Admiralty to make one other trial, under the auspices of the successful navigator. Accordingly, on the 10th of February, 1776, he was appointed to the command in his old and trusty ship, the Resolution, and Captain Clerke, in the Discovery, was ordered to accompany him. Cook's instructions were to proceed direct to the Pacific Ocean, and thence to try the passage by way of Behring's Straits, and as it was necessary that the islands in the Southern Ocean should be revisited, cattle and sheep, with other animals and all kinds of seeds, were shipped for the advantage of the inhabitants. The Resolution sailed on the 12th of July, 1776. The Discovery was to follow, having on board a native of the Sandwich Islands to act as interpreter. Nothing of importance occurred on the outward voyage, and on the 12th of February, 1777, Cook arrived at Queen Charlotte's Sound, New Zealand, where he anchored. He found the natives suspiciously shy, and no amount of persuasion could induce them to venture on board. They had reason for their uneasiness. On the last voyage the Adventure had visited this place, and 10 of her crew had been killed in an unpremeditated skirmish. They apprehended chastisement, and thought it best to be on the alert. It was not convenient for Cook to add to any ill feeling that might exist, so he said nothing about the massacre, but tried to conciliate. From the Sound the ship proceeded to some of the South Sea Islands, where they obtained a plentiful supply of provisions, but were greatly annoyed by the thievish propensities of the natives. To check this, Cook hit upon a new device. He seized the culprit and shaved his head, thus making him an object of ridicule to his countrymen, and enabling the English to keep their eyes on him. At Tonga Tabou, generous hospitality was shown to them, and the king invited Cook to reside with him in his house. Here he made a distribution of animals among the chiefs, explaining their uses, and how to preserve them. A horse and mare, a bull and cow, several sheep and turkeys were thus given away. But, in spite of this kindly reciprocity, thieving still went on. Cook became incensed, and determined that he would put a stop to it at any risk. 2 kids and 2 turkey cocks were abstracted from the stores. The captain seized 3 canoes, put a guard over the chiefs, and insisted that not only the kids and turkeys should be restored, but also everything that had been taken away since their arrival. Much of the plunder was returned, but the chiefs, who were friendly, probably felt themselves insulted. After remaining nearly 3 months in these hospitable but unprincipled regions, Cook took his departure for Otaheite, and thence for Matavai Bay, where he presented King Otu with the remainder of his livestock, among which were a horse and mare. To show the natives the use of the latter animals, Captains Cook and Clerke rode about the island on horseback, much to the astonishment of the simple people. More civilized people have sometimes been astonished when they saw, for the first time, Mr. Jack Tar astride a horse. The wonder of the natives never abated. At Huaheine, a thief occasioned the voyagers much trouble. He was a determined rascal, and shaving his head and beard, and cutting off his ears, had no moral effect on him. He persisted in his evil ways, and defied public opinion. At Ulictea, several desertions took place, the deserters being sheltered by the Indians. Both Captain Clerke and Captain Cook went in pursuit of the fugitives, but without success. The latter, therefore, ordered the chief's son, daughter, and son-in-law to be seized, and held as hostages until the deserters were given up. The remedy was effectual, and in a few days an exchange was effected. This severe policy of Cook was intended to save the spilling of innocent blood, but it produced much indignation among the savages, who felt that it was an outrage to seize the highest persons in their land for every trivial offense. Even at this early day schemes were afoot to assassinate Cook and Clerke. On the 2nd of January the ships resumed their voyage northward. They passed several islands, the inhabitants of which, though at an immense distance from Otaheite, spoke the same language. Those who came on board displayed the utmost astonishment at everything they saw, and it was evident that they had never seen a ship before. They resembled the South Sea Islanders in another unpleasant respect. They were passionately addicted to stealing. To a group of these islands Captain Cook gave the name of the Sandwich Islands. New Albion was made on the 7th of March, the ships then being in latitude 44 degrees 33 minutes north, and after sailing along it till the 29th, they came to anchor in a small cove lying in latitude 49 degrees 29 minutes north. A brisk trade commenced with the natives, who appeared to be well acquainted with the value of iron, and were eager to get it in exchange for skins, etc., rough and manufactured into garments. But the most extraordinary articles which they offered in trade were human skulls, and hands not quite stripped of the flesh, and which had the appearance of having been recently on the fire. Thieving was practised in a dexterous and educated manner, but the natives were strict in being paid for everything they supplied to the ships, with which rule Cook was happy to comply. This inlet was called King George's Sound, but it was afterward ascertained that the natives called it Nootka Sound, by which name it is more commonly known. From this point they exercised the greatest watchfulness, hoping to find an outlet into the Atlantic Ocean, but, as every one knows, without success. Cook was able, however, to ascertain the relative positions of the two continents, Asia and America, whose extremities he observed. He explored the coasts in Behring's Straits, where they found some Russian traders. The ships then quitted the harbor of Samgoonodah and sailed for the Sandwich Islands, Captain Cook intending to await the season there, and then return to Kamtschatka. In latitude 20° 55', they discovered the island of Maui, and a few days later fell in with another, which the natives called Owyhee, the extent of which was so great that the voyagers were nearly 7 weeks sailing around it and examining the coast. The inhabitants were extremely pleasant, and appeared to be entirely free from suspicion. Their canoes flocked around the ships in hundreds, and came well laden too, but the gentlemen were light-fingered and had but little fear of gunpowder. Captain Cook had an interview with Terreeoboo, king of the islands, in which great formality was observed on both sides, followed by an exchange of presents and an exchange of names. The natives were extremely deferential to Cook, displaying almost an amount of adoration. A society of priests, native, furnished the ships with a plentiful supply of hogs and vegetables, without requiring any return. On the day previous to their departure, the king sent them an immense quantity of cloth, many boatloads of vegetables, and a whole herd of hogs. The ships then sailed, but on the following day encountered such a severe storm that they had to put back in order to repair damages. They anchored at the old spot, and for a time things went on pleasantly. But a theft took place, and the seamen, becoming enraged at losing every trifling article they possessed, had an affray with the natives. It was not a trifling article in this instance, however, being, in fact, no smaller than the cutter of the ship Discovery. The boats of both vessels were immediately sent in search of her, and Captain Cook went on shore to arrange matters in a determined spirit. The robbery was of the most audacious kind, and certainly merited punishment, but it is questionable if Cook's policy, considering the kindness he had so lately experienced, was the best that could have been devised. Cook left the Resolution about 7 o'clock, attended by the lieutenant of marines, a sergeant, a corporal, and 7 private men. The pinnace's crew were likewise armed, and under the command of Mr. Roberts, the launch was also ordered to assist his own boat. On landing there was not the slightest symptom of hostility. Crowds gathered around the Englishmen, and were kept in order by the chiefs, who seemed desirous that everything should proceed in an orderly and pleasant manner. Captain Cook proceeded to the king's house, and requested that he would go on board the Resolution, intending, of course, to keep him as a hostage. The king, individually, offered but few objections, but his people evidently understood the maneuver, and quietly commenced arming themselves with spears, clubs, and daggers, and protecting themselves with the thick mats which they usually donned in time of war, like armor. While affairs were in this state, a canoe arrived from the opposite side of the bay, and announced that one of the native chiefs had been killed by a shot from the Discovery's boat. Indignant excitement now agitated the crowd. The women retired, and the men openly uttered threats. Cook, perceiving the threatening aspect that things had assumed, ordered Lieutenant Middleton to march his marines down to the boats, to which the islanders offered no objection. He then escorted the king, attended by his wife, 2 sons, and several chiefs. One of the sons had already entered the pinnace, expecting his father to follow, when the king's wife entreated him not to leave the shore, or he would be put to death. Matters were now hurrying to a crisis. A chief with a dagger concealed under his cloak was observed watching Cook, and the lieutenant of marines wanted to fire at him, but this the captain would not permit. The chief gained new courage by this hesitation, and closed on them, and the officer struck him with his firelock. Another native interfered and grasped the sergeant's musket, and was compelled to let it go by a blow from the lieutenant. Cook, seeing that it was useless to attempt to force the king off, was about to give orders to re-embark, when a man flung a stone at him, which he returned by discharging small shot from the barrels of his piece. The man, being scarcely hurt, brandished his spear as if about to hurl it at the captain, who at once knocked him down, but refrained from using ball. He then addressed the crowd and endeavored to restore peace, but while so engaged a man was observed behind a double canoe in the act of darting a spear at the captain. Seeing that his life was really in danger, Cook fired, but killed the wrong man. The sergeant of marines, however, instantly brought down the offender with his musket. For a moment the islanders seemed to lose some of their impetuosity, but the crowds that had gathered behind pressed on those who were the immediate spectators of what had occurred, and, what was even more fatal, poured in a volley of stones. The marines, without waiting for orders, returned the compliment with a general discharge of musketry, which was directly succeeded by a brisk fire from the boats. Cook was surprised and vexed at this accidental turn of affairs, and waved his hand to the boats to desist, and come on shore to embark the marines. The pinnace unhesitatingly obeyed, but the lieutenant in the launch, instead of pulling in to the assistance of his commander, rowed farther off, at the very moment when his services were most required. The marines crowded into the pinnace with precipitation and confusion, and were so jammed together that they were unable to protect themselves. Those who were on shore kept up the fire, but the moment their pieces were discharged, the islanders rushed upon them and forced the party into the water, where 4 of them were killed and the lieutenant wounded. When this occurred, Cook was standing alone on a rock near the shore. Seeing, however, that it was now clearly a matter of escape, he hurried toward the pinnace, holding his left arm round the back of his head to shield it from stones, and carrying his musket in his right hand. A remarkably agile warrior, a relation of the king's, was seen to follow him, and before his object could be frustrated, sprang forward upon the captain, and struck him a heavy blow on the back of his head, and then turned and fled. Cook staggered a few paces, dropped his musket, and fell on his hands and one knee. Before he could recover himself, another islander rushed forward, and with an iron dagger stabbed him in the neck. He sank into the water, and was immediately set upon by a number of savages, who tried to keep him down, but he succeeded in getting his head up. The pinnace was within half a dozen yards of him, and he cast an imploring look as if for assistance. The islanders forced him down again in a deeper place, but his great muscular strength enabled him to recover himself and cling to the rock. He was not there for more than a moment when a brutal savage dealt him a heavy blow with a club, and he fell down lifeless. The Indians then hauled his corpse upon the rock and ferociously stabbed it all over, handing the dagger from one to another, in order that all might participate in the sweet revenge. The body was left for some time upon the rock, and the islanders gave way, as though afraid of the act they had committed, but there was no attempt to recover it by the ship's crew, and it was subsequently cut up, together with the bodies of the marines, and the parts distributed among the chiefs. The mutilated fragments were afterward restored and committed to the deep, with all the honours due to the rank of the deceased. Thus ingloriously perished one of England's greatest navigators, whose services to science have never been surpassed by any man belonging to his profession. It may almost be said, says Mr. Robert Chambers, that he fell a victim to his humanity. For if, instead of retreating before his barbarous pursuers with the view to spare their lives, he had turned revengefully upon them, his fate might have been very different. The command of the Resolution devolved on Captain Clerke, and Mr. Gore acted as commander of the Discovery. After making some further explorations among the Sandwich Islands, the vessels visited Kamtschatka and Behring's Straits. There it was found impossible to accomplish the objects of the expedition, and it returned southward. Another misfortune befell the voyagers. On the 22nd of August, 1779, Captain Clerke died of consumption. The ships visited Kamtschatka once more, and then returned by way of China, arriving in England on the 4th of October, 1780, after an absence of 4 years, 2 months, and 22 days. When it became known in England that Captain Cook had perished, all classes of people expressed their sympathy and deep sorrow. The king granted a pension of £200 per annum to his widow, and £25 per annum to each of her children. The Royal Society had a gold medal struck in commemoration of his services, and at home and abroad honours were scattered on his memory. That Cook was justly entitled to these testimonials is beyond a doubt, not only for the good he did his country, but for his own individual merit. It would be difficult to find a more brilliant instance of purely self-made greatness. Starting in life under circumstances of the most depressing nature, he succeeded solely by the force of industry in acquiring accomplishments which gave him the foremost place among the scientific men of his age. From the obscure condition of a foremost man on a collier, he rose to be the greatest discoverer of modern times. A recapitulation of what he accomplished may appropriately close this sketch. He discovered New Caledonia and Norfolk Island, New Georgia, and the Sandwich and many smaller islands in the Pacific, surveyed the Society Islands, the Friendly Islands, and the New Hebrides, determined the insularity of New Zealand, circumnavigated the globe in a high southern latitude, so as to decide that no continent existed north of a certain parallel, explored the then unknown eastern coasts of New Holland for 2,000 miles, determined the proximity of Asia to America, which the discoverer of Behring's Straits did not perceive, and wherever he went brought strange people into communication with the civilized world, through the wide gates of commerce and mutual interest. The rock where Captain Cook fell is an object of curiosity in Hawaii to the present day. The natives point it out with sorrow, and show the stump of a cocoanut tree, where they say he expired. The upper part of this tree has been carried to England, and is preserved in the Museum of Greenwich Hospital. On the remaining stump, which has been carefully capped with copper, is the following inscription: "Near this spot fell Captain James Cook, R.N., the renowned circumnavigator who discovered these islands, A.D. 1778." End of section 133.